coming back to levels of risk in emerging markets, what are the factors that make some countries go into the fast lane, if you will, make them better investment prospects, and some remain in the slow lane?
Well, you're talking about Africa here, are you? And,
yes.
Paul Collier's bottom billion, failed and failing states, and I think there's a very clear problem with a number of countries, and the nub of it is really governance. The most important thing in arguably the 20th century, when there's a lot happened in the 20th century, but arguably the thing that impacted the lives of most people, more people than anything else, was actually the end of the Cold War, not the Second World War. And we had over 100 countries go from sort of authoritarian rule within the sort of dynamics, international dynamics of the Cold War, where foreign policy was all about supporting one's enemy's enemy, and we didn't really care about economic policy. All that's changed. And for 20 years now, we live in a very, very different environment. Emerging markets have made lots of mistakes in this process, but they've now got extremely good policies, much better in many cases than we've got in the West. They're very flexible, they have reserves, they're well-managed economies, etc. And there are exceptions. And so what we see in North Africa, for me, is a relic. It's what's happening in North Africa this last year, the last 12 months, is really a reflection of what happened in Latin America 20 years ago.
Yes.
But
is the argument then that Africa will catch up with Latin America?
Well, it does depend on governance. So what we do have in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's also Central Asia to some extent as well, similar problems. You have what Paul Collier, the professor at Oxford, calls failed failing states, and the problem with these states, of course, is largely to do with the governance structure, with the corruption, with the lack of incentives, the lack of capital because of property rights, etc. There are things that can be done. We fortunately do have, particularly in Africa, a second generation of leaders now. And there's a lot of people thinking about altering, particularly the aid program, to allow better incentivization of good, towards good governance. And there is also, I think, a huge need to get the private sector market involved in these countries. And to do that, you need the benchmark sovereign bond. That's the absolute first starting point.
And does more competition help growth?
Generally speaking, if you don't have competition, you have collusion, and that doesn't help, of course. I mean, we know that from Adam Smith and before, in fact. And not just that, but of course, we know from Victorian England, the philosophy of free markets, which was proposed, which was pushed very hard by Bentham and Mill and others, came with it an enormous expansion of legislation. There's even in the introduction of Hayek's Road to Serfdom, this famous book about not letting the state do anything. It's very, very clear. There's this wonderful paragraph where I'm paraphrasing. He says that no sensible person in their right mind would have laissez-faire because people collude, but in the second half of the paragraph, sometimes we promote it because all the alternatives are worse. And I think one has to understand that that's the basis. Economists don't actually think that you get competition by just standing back. It does require governance. It does require law and order. It does require property rights and stability. And that often requires a huge amount of effort up front. And our own history shows in the West, how many centuries it's taken to get to where we are. We have a lot of experience. That's where our aid programs, I think, should be focused, together with coordinating foreign policy, military policy, and aid policy. So we actually have a very clear incentive pattern for governments to stay on the, they sign up to it, intervene without their prior permission, if you like. But I do think that we need a coordinated and very, very clear incentive pattern, and then that allows private sector. Hernando de Soto, who you may have heard of, is Peruvian, very, very
property rights,
very, very keen on property rights. And what he's saying is that capital is a process. It's not the same as money. Capital is something that reproduces itself, and if you have a house, it's not necessarily capital. But if you have secure property rights, which everybody recognises, and those are recognisable by courts, and those property rights are fully transferable, then you can borrow money against it, and with that money you can start a business, and suddenly that becomes property, becomes capital. And that is, those sort of things could release enormous entrepreneurial potential in Africa. But it requires the right legislation, the right institutional framework and stability, and of course there's still not enough capital. You need foreign capital to capitalise a lot of this.
Coming down to the company level, what are the kind of companies that have come out of emerging markets that you think are promising? Because a whole new generation of multinationals now exist in outside of the developed world.
Yes. Well, again, an impossible question, because it's, which sort of companies do I like on the planet, or maybe just half the planet in emerging markets? I mean, I think one likes different companies for different reasons and at different times. By the way, that's why you need a manager. You don't just sort of stick a pin in and
hope for the best.
Hope for the best. I mean, active management does actually work, and the first role of active management, of course, is to reduce risk in real time when things don't start not working. But I do think there is a broadening, and I think to answer your question in a slightly different way, we do have to challenge the perception that emerging markets are sort of, just sort of unilinear, lineal sort of relations, have linear relationships with some other thing, like, it's just about commodities. I mean, clearly that's not the case, because a lot of Asian economies are big commodity importers.
Yes.
It's much more complex, and I think what we're going to start to see is that complexity coming through. Clearly, though, I mean, to give you some sort of answer, we are going to see a huge growth in domestic consumption across a wide number of emerging market countries. The real problems in the developed world has motivated, I think there was a motive before, but it's really capitalised the desire to wean oneself off dependence of exports to Europe and the United States. And there's a lot more South-South trade, but also a lot more focus on domestic demand, which again will ultimately start driving global prices for consumption goods.
I think the South-South thing and trading across several countries was what I was chasing in terms of...
No, it's clearly increasing, and from a very low start, but in a very, very big way. And you can see that in all sorts of statistics, not just trade statistics, investment statistics, and also swap lines, the use of other currencies in central bank reserves.
Jerome, thanks for talking to me today.
Thank you.